As already concluded during the unboxing video, the panel lines need some scribing. Mainly the ones around the windows. They are double for the rubber and for the optional chrome trim, so I need to pay extra attention to those, carefully just scribing them out to make them a bit deeper and not disappear after adding a couple coats of paint. Carefully going through those, moving on to the ones around the doors and all the other ones. After all those panel lines were now nice and deep and could stay visible after some paint, I took out my permanent marker to mark off all of these mold lines. Mold lines are not supposed to be there and are left behind from the molding process. It's a bit of extra squeezed out plastic, so I just mark them off with a permanent marker to have a visual on where they are, and also use that marker as a guide coat. Once the marker has been sanded off, so should the mold line be as well. And after marking all of them, I now can clearly see where they are. I take out my sanding sticks to carefully sand them off. Once removed, I take out some 600 grit sanding sponges. You can also just use some regular 600 grit sandpaper and then sand that area smooth to remove the rougher grit from the sanding sticks. Once those were all nice and smooth, I moved on to the rest of the body, also sanding that down with the same 600 grit in order to give it a bit of a key so that the primer sticks better to the plastic. And if you are planning to mask it off in a further stage, it shouldn't peel off the paint, because if you don't, the plastic will be too smooth and the primer doesn't really have anything to grab onto and it will pull off. Now in this case I'm sanding it, so it should have a mechanical lock and not just pull off. The body is now all prepped and ready for primer, so I stirred up the primer, put it in the airbrush, moved on to those hard to reach, easy to forget spots, and then applied a couple light coats to the rest of the body. First coat is applied, is covering up nicely. I let it sit for about 5 minutes to dry in between, and then applied a second coat in the same way I applied the first one. The second coat is now applied and I let it sit and dry for about 60 minutes before moving on to sanding it down with some 3000 grit sanding sponges. Now the reason I'm sanding it down is to make the primer as smooth as it can possibly be, so that the paint colors that I will apply on top of it will also have a nice smooth base to be applied to. I'm using 3000 grit as those sanding scratches will not be visible after the application of some color coats. Lower grits like 2000 grit might work. I won't risk 1500 or 1000 as that could be too rough and will potentially show through after applying the color. I just removed all of the dust, moved back into the booth and filled the airbrush up with some silver to start applying the color. The easy to forget, hard to reach spots are now done and I can move on to the rest of the body. I'm just applying a couple of light coats of this silver. Now you might be wondering if this is the final color, and the answer to that is yes. If you've watched the previous video series on the Lamborghini Miura, I painted that in a silver to cover the red plastic and act as a bright base for the following colors. And I really like the look of a silver on a classic car with some nice sharp lines like the Miura and also like this Pantera. So I decided on silver. I will be adding a second color later on, but for now I'm just applying the silver and we'll be sealing that with some clear coat. first coat is applied and it's already looking nice and smooth, so I set it aside for about 10 minutes to dry and moved on to applying the second coat. I applied in the same way I did the first, not going too heavy, just keeping it nice, thin and even. After this second coat was applied, I again set it aside for about 10 minutes and moved on to applying a third coat. Now the third coat might not have been necessary as it already covered nicely after the first and second coat, but I wanted to be sure that I had a nice even finish and did not miss any spots whatsoever. With the final coat of silver now applied, I set it aside for about 25 minutes to dry up, moved on to mixing my 2K diamond clear and started applying it. The first coat of clear is applied and it went on nice and smooth. I applied it a bit thicker as I did not have any decals to be worried about. I let it sit for 5 minutes to dry in between and applied a second coat to finish it off and get a super smooth, nice and glossy finish. The second coat is now also applied and is nice and even. I checked it over, I didn't miss any spots, and I'm really happy with the way that it turned out. So I set it aside for about 48 to 72 hours to cure before moving on to masking it up in order to start painting the second color.